Dr. Beatrice Golomb is Associate Professor of Medicine and of Family and Preventive Medicine and a practicing internist at the University of California, San Diego. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics, a PhD in Biology, and an MD degree. She trained as a postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute and at RAND, UCLA. Her presentation is titled Representation of Drug Benefits versus Harms, the Impact of Conflict of Interest.
We see a woman in a grocery store with her husband examining a cereal box, and she says apparently some of the additives cause a nerve disorder, but some of the other additives cure it. Like this cereal, most drugs have risks as well as benefits, and our obligation as scientists is to equitably adjudicate the degree to which each occur, and as physicians to represent that reasonably to our patients. Expectations are that, or best patient care requires that, the data procured by scientific studies should conform to the truth. The published evidence should in turn conform to the data that's been procured, and the practice should conform to the published evidence. Practice as mediated in turn by education, CME, which stands for Continuing Medical Education and Guidelines. And the question that we'll be addressing in this talk is, are these expectations met, primarily focusing on this and this point, with this addressed more in the talk tomorrow. So the title is, or a version of the title is Treatment Risks and Benefits Stacking the Deck. And the thesis is that there's an imbalance in information dissemination that relatively favors drug benefits over drug harms. And I've found that this has been the case for virtually every drug class or drug that I've studied on my own or for RAND, including statins, the anthrax vaccine, that should have been aspirin, and pyridostigmine bromide. And I came to this issue because initially I was confused as to why this occurred. Why was it the case that the guidelines said this, whereas the published evidence very clearly said something different? And this imbalance in information dissemination occurs at virtually every level. Which studies are done, which of the ones that are done are published, and what in those studies is said. Which of those studies are propagated to reviews and editorials, what happens at the level of the medical journal that determines whether an article is accepted for publication, which of the published evidence is disseminated via media, via medical education, by advertisements to physicians, what is the influence of regulators, including such regulatory agencies as the FDA, how does this operate at the level of advocacy groups like patient groups, and other groups like the Institute of Medicine that generates reports and academ, and finally, how does this propagate to practice in patients, including generation of guidelines according to which many of us physicians receive performance pay. So as we'll see, there are disparities in how studies are designed, how studies are published, and how the findings are disseminated, and in turn, how these translate to guidelines. So we'll start with the issue of published data versus data that are procured. And as we'll see in the slides to follow, it is commonly the case that unfavorable results are not submitted. There's even recent evidence that data are falsified in a fashion to make them look more favorable, that bad results are portrayed as though they are good, and that good results, studies that look favorable, may be published not once but multiple times in a way that obscures the fact that it's the same study. So don't submit bad results. There are a number of articles that now show that pharmaceutical company-sponsored studies are less likely to be published than other studies. But, favorable studies are not less likely to be published. And we'll see some evidence that gives us a suggestion of how great the disparity in this is. So this is a wonderful analysis that was done by the FDA looking at antidepressant drug trials. And recently, we've inaugurated this idea of having clinical trial registries so that if a randomized controlled trial wants to ever have the chance of being published in one of the higher tier journals, it has to be entered into a registry at the time of or prior to the trial's inception. So now we actually have access to the information that there were trials that existed that may or may not have actually been published. And the FDA can go back to the drug companies and ask for information relative to the trials that were not published. And analyzing antidepressant study data, the FDA analysts found that there were 38 studies that appeared to have positive results, of which 37 were published and one was not. There were 36 studies that were viewed by the FDA, by the way, that's 97%, 36 studies viewed by the FDA as having negative or questionable results, and with only 3 exceptions, or 8%, either these were not published at all, the vast majority of them, or they were published in a way that misleadingly conveyed the outcome as though it were favorable. So that a doctor or researcher or patient going to the medical literature would see that 94% of the trials appeared favorable compared to reality, at least as indexed by FDA analysts, which found that it was 51%, essentially the difference between unanimity and a coin toss. And what does this mean? This means that, for example, this is a case where, okay, about half the studies were favorable and half weren't. But if it carries to other drug classes and about 8% of unfavorable studies are published compared to 97% of favorable studies, then you would actually need to have at least 12 times as many unfavorable as favorable studies to look like there were an equal number. And even if you had 11 times as many unfavorable studies, good studies would still appear to exceed unfavorable ones in the medical literature. And this is the evidence that published favorable results may be republished multiple times. This was a careful analysis done on randomized control trial, that's RCT, data for a drug called ondansetron, which is used as an antiemetic. And the authors were specifically looking at the impact of this plural publication on meta-analysis, which is where you pool all the high-quality studies in order to enhance the statistical power to see an effect. And they found that 17% of published full results of randomized trials and 28% of the patient data were duplicated. Trials reporting greater treatment effect were significantly more likely to be duplicated. And inclusion, and by the way, trials were published as many as 5 times. Inclusion of these duplicated data in meta-analyses led to a 23% overestimation of the efficacy of this drug, and different author lists and study details obscured the fact that it was the same study being republished, so that no previous person who had done reviews in this field had actually detected that these were the same studies. Recently, evidence has emerged of something that I had always hoped wasn't the case. I'd always hoped that they just selectively published what looked good and led to problems by omission. But there's been an ongoing debate about a diabetes drug called Avandia, which has led to some conflicts between the safety office at the FDA and the new drug office at the FDA. And we'll talk actually a little bit more about that later. But there have been concerns aired since the late 1990s that this drug class may cause an increased rate of cardiovascular problems, which of course is exactly what you're trying to prevent in diabetes and with diabetes drugs. And Glaxo relied heavily on a particular clinical trial in insisting that the claims of these excess adverse cardiovascular events were exaggerated. But FDA New Drug Office analyst Thomas Marciniak did something virtually unprecedented in the FDA. He actually looked at the patient records instead of just relying on the data handed to him by the drug company. And he found at least a dozen serious cardiovascular events in the active treatment group that had not been counted among adverse events. And he said that had he had time, he'd probably have found more. And the examples of these were not minor events, were a hospitalization for brain hemorrhage, a 67-day hospitalization for stroke, for which no cardiovascular event was recorded. Those were both either omitted or erased from the records, and a death from a serious heart problem that was recoded as of unknown but non-cardiovascular cause. So once these 12 cases were added to the file for record, not only did the study no longer undermine the findings from previous studies, but in fact it strongly supported them. And actually, Jerome Kasserer, from the former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, pointed out what is obvious, which is that this undermines the whole medical literature on which we base our medical decisions. So what is some of the evidence on how big the impact is of these disparities in publication on published drug studies? Well, we have actually some cute information from head-to-head trials of drugs in the same class that are generally approximately equivalent. And one trial was cutely entitled Why Olanzapine Beats Risperidone, Risperidone Beats Quetiapine, and Quetiapine Beats Olanzapine, an exploratory analysis of head-to-head comparison studies of second-generation antipsychotics. And basically the finding was, whichever company funded the study, theirs was the drug that came out better, or at least a good 90% at the time. And by the way, similar analyses had been performed with similar findings for other classes of drugs, like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, Advil, et cetera, and also statin cholesterol-lowering drugs. And here we have a granting agent. This at least if you said drug company here, you're completely free to carry out whatever research you want, so long as you come to these conclusions. And the following slide will show that something very close to this happens, at least for industry-funded studies. So this is a study that looked at medicinal analysis for statins. In multivariate analysis of industry-funded statin head-to-head randomized trials comparing two different statins, funding from the test drug company was associated with results and conclusions that favored the test drug, controlling for other factors, with an odds ratio of 20-to-1 for results and 35-to-1 for conclusions. So that even if you couldn't make the results look better, which overwhelmingly you could still represent them as better in the conclusions. And the observation I have is if for two drugs, neither inherently superior to the other, any one can be made to look better than the other with an odds of 20-to-1 for results and 35-to-1 for conclusions, what implications does this have where you have two drugs neither inherently better and one of those drugs is called placebo? Evidence suggests that these disparities translate beyond the primary data studies to reviews and editorials, with the additional infusion of other problems, such as ghostwriting, and also we'll discuss editorials and published opinion. So Dr. David Healy, a UK psychopharmacologist, said of his field that there's probably no other area of medicine in which the academic literature is so at odds with the raw data. A possible explanation is that this literature has had a significant ghostwriting input. And I think he's not wrong about his literature, but he may be wrong about assuming that it's worse in his area than in other cases. And in fact, the discovery process during litigation against drug companies seems again and again and again to show that ghostwriting is standard operations for industry. Oops. I'm trying to go back. Previous. OK, I think I was trying to go back one more. OK. Thank you. One more? Two more? One more. There we go. OK. So per the discovery process in litigation regarding pushing of off-label indications for the drug gabapentin or Neurontin, it was ascertained that Park Davis had contracted with, these are medical education and communication companies, these are for-profit companies essentially purely funded by pharma, to develop articles, review papers, and letters to the editors of medical journals, putting its products in a favorable light. The MEC would get around $13,000 to $18,000 per article and would in turn pay $1,000 each to friendly doctors and pharmacists to be the listed authors for advertising parading as science that was then published in the actual reputable medical literature. And the reader would not know of any involvement of pharma or the MAC. So for clinical trials, the situation is a little bit better because clinical trials are very expensive to do. You certainly can't get a significant sized clinical trial for under $1 million, and generally they cost substantially more. So there has to have been some source of funding generally conveyed. And in this other discovery process, this time for litigation against Merck in the case of Vioxx, it was ascertained that for clinical trials, Merck employees worked either independently or collaborating with these MACs to prepare manuscripts, and they recruited academically affiliated investigators to be authors. The recruited authors were often placed as the first and second authors on these papers. For scientific review papers, Merck marketing employees developed plans for manuscripts, contracted with these medical publishing companies to ghostwrite manuscripts, and recruited academically affiliated investigators to be the listed authors. In this case, they were often the sole author and often offered honoraria for their participation. So of the articles that were examined, 92% of the clinical trial articles did disclose financial support. They just had the added patina of credibility that comes with having academic authorship at the head of the author list. But only 50% of review articles either disclosed Merck sponsorship or disclosed any financial compensation to the author from the company, so that there's this, as we'll see, sizable burden of review and editorial articles out there that people perceive to be of independent origin that are in fact manufactured by industry. So here we have a slide with an executive pointing to the specimen and saying the doctor himself may not be free, but he can be had pretty cheaply. And in fact, I had a hallway debate with a Merck outcomes researcher a few years ago, whom I knew because we'd both been fellows at a 14-day American Heart Association conference and assigned to the same small group. And in this hallway debate, I was impugning the credibility of drug-conducted studies. And he said, Beatrice, if you think studies done by academics are any better, you're just naive. And I thought he was going to then defend drug company studies, but instead what he said is, you'd be amazed about academics, how cheaply they can be bought. So the previous drug company slide that says they can be bought pretty cheaply was actually parroted from the mouth of somebody who worked for industry. And at least it was honest of him to say that. And in fact, in my own experience, I've seen a group of physicians bought out for about $5. And if I have time, I can share that story. And evidence suggests that companies, industry, not necessarily just the drug industry, but other industries that have a financial stake in medical outcomes may actually flood the market with favorably spun reviews. So an analysis was done of studies of passive smoking, and of 106 review articles on this topic, it was found that 37% concluded that passive smoking was not harmful, while the rest concluded that it was. A JAMA study looked at the determinants of these disparities in conclusions. Was the quality of the review a factor? Whether the journal was peer-reviewed, the year of publication? But the only predictor they found was whether there was tobacco industry involvement by the authors. And the conflicts of interest that they ascertained were rarely disclosed. Less than a fourth of the time. They actually had to have access to different databases to ascertain these conflicts of interest. And in fact, 3/4 of the favorable papers came from identifiable industry sources. But with this information a minute ago about how MECs contact academic authors, how do we really even know that the remaining 1/4 were all free of conflict of interest? The authors of this article suggest that the tobacco industry may be attempting to influence scientific opinion by flooding the scientific literature with large numbers of review articles supporting its position that passive smoking is not harmful to health. And this may have additional ramifications which our lawyer may or may not choose to comment on because of something called the Daubert principle, which, as I understand it, means that if you call an expert witness in a medical case, his expertise is not considered applicable unless if it departs from the standard as represented in the literature. So if you are creating the standard through these processes of ghostwriting, et cetera, my impression is that that would have potential applicability to the court system as well, one of the few systems that may be available to redress issues. So regarding editorials and published opinion, there's evidence, obviously, or not surprisingly, that there are strong disparities in the stated opinions of authors as a function of their conflicts of interest with industry. An analysis was done just at the time, around the time that calcium channel blockers were being deposed as the best-selling class of prescription drugs in the United States. These were a class of blood pressure-lowering drugs that came on board, and because they were still on patent, they were heavily marketed by industry, causing them to surpass other drugs like thiazides and beta blockers, which they were actually never proven to be better than, but had much better marketing for. And then some suggestions started coming out that the short-acting dihydropyridine calcium channel blockers, or CCBs, may actually have caused cardiovascular adverse events. And during the time that this debate sort of was being aired, and ultimately it did lead these calcium channel blockers to no longer be used for routine blood pressure management, somebody analyzed whether people's published attitudes toward calcium channel blockers were unfavorable, neutral, or supportive as a function of whether they had conflicts of interest with either calcium channel blocker manufacturing drug companies or any drug company. And I guess it's surprisingly high rates of conflict of interest across the board, but on average, it's around 40% for unfavorable, 60 to 70% for neutral, and 100% of the articles that expressed supportive opinions of calcium channel blockers during that period of evidence had authors that had industry conflicts of interest. And one way to represent these findings is that at that time, in that climate of evidence, the only way you could have a favorable opinion about these drugs is through industry conflict. And by the way, I'm not going to go into the issue of reviewer bias, but these experts, the people who publish on these drugs, are then the people who serve as peer reviewers when someone else submits a paper. And somebody earlier commented, it might have been Dr. Nass, about a study that sometime later hadn't been published. I think it was on the anthrax vaccines. But it's not completely up to the author whether the study has been published. And if there's something a reviewer doesn't like to see, that study may not be published for reasons that have nothing to do with the author's preferences. So obviously, bias in terms of what literature is available about risks and benefits of drugs operates at the level of what studies are funded. Almost all of the major drug randomized controlled trials, certainly all of the ones in my field of statins, are industry funded. Then which ones are submitted, what aspects of them are included in the submissions, ghost writing, et cetera. But also, it emerges that bias operates at the level of the medical journals. And it would be nice to think of medical journals as these neutral bastions of truth and light. But unfortunately, medical journals, almost all of them many of them are for-profit companies that make their profit by drug company advertising and also by sales of glossy reprints of drug company favorable articles back to the company, sometimes for $100,000 or more per article. And so there's evidence that publishing a favorable article can yield financial gain through this direct process of reprint sales. And publishing unfavorable, as we will see, there's evidence can lead to financial loss. So needless to say, this leads to economic incentives advantaging publication of drug company favorable articles by mainstream medical journals. And so in fact, at least 4 editors-in-chief of major medical journals have penned tomes decrying the inimical impact of industry influence on medical publishing, including Richard Smith, the former editor-in-chief of the BMJ, Jerome Kasser, a former editor-in-chief of New England Journal, Marcia Angel, former editor-in-chief of New England Journal. I think Richard Horton has, and I think there's at least one other person who has. And as Richard Smith and Horton were said to have said, and I'm putting in quotes because it was in the article, but I don't know which one of these is allegedly quoted, journals have devolved into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry, say Dr. Richard Smith, former editor of BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and Dr. Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, also based in Britain. Because journals profit handsomely by selling drug companies reprints of articles reporting findings from large clinical trials involving their products, editors may, quote, face a frighteningly stark conflict of interest in deciding whether to publish a study, Dr. Smith said. Journals aggressively advertise reprint sales on their websites, and companies may spend up to $1 million on purchasing reprints. Most medical journals have no policies on conflict of interest for their editors, or based on these findings, perhaps they might even have an incentive to favor the right kinds of conflict of interest, and publish a trial that will bring $100,000 of profit, or meet the end of the year budget goals by firing the editor who declined to publish the shoddy quality favorable article. And the stakes have become high. A few journals that not long ago measured profits in the tens of thousands of dollars a year now make millions, according to at least 3 editors who agreed to discuss finances with the New York Times, only if granted anonymity. And there's evidence in addition that publishing, in addition to favorable economic incentives for publishing, there actually is evidence of unfavorable outcomes when publications disadvantage industry. And Annals of Internal Medicine published an article on the impact of drug company advertising on physician behavior that was unflattering to industry. And somebody analyzed the apparent impact of publication of that article on Annals of Internal Medicine's revenue, looking at sort of the revenue curve before versus after compared to other journals. And their study of the apparent 4-year impact was it led to a loss of between $1 and $1.5 million in revenues for that journal. And as the head of the RAND healthcare program, in advising me not to look at drug risk benefit, said every medical journal sat up and took notice. And in fact, one might suppose that this would lead to journals possibly selecting not to publish unfavorable articles because of the potential for financial repercussions. And indeed, there is evidence that journals have failed to publish favorably reviewed articles that were unfavorable to industry for reasons unrelated to the soundness of the article. And we have that evidence because in one case, an editor actually put it in writing to the author. There was an editorial submitted to a reputable kidney journal called Transplantation and Dialysis that questioned the efficacy of erythropoietin. This is the same drug that athletes use to dope their blood so that they have better oxygen carrying capacity and athletic performance, that questioned the use of erythropoietin, which is made by the kidneys, in end-stage kidney disease, and incidentally the soundness of the National Kidney Foundation guidelines, citing flawed logic in the claims of survival benefit. In a letter to the author, the executive editor noted that all 3 reviewers favored publication, as did he. Unfortunately, I have been overruled by our marketing department. And it's only because A, he put this in writing, and B, the author then sent this on to Richard Smith and asked, what should I do, that this was aired in BMJ and then led actually, ultimately, after the adverse publicity, to them publishing the article. But we have no idea how often this happens. With editors using the far more common phraseology, we do not believe this article would be of interest to our readership. And this is an example of what I consider sort of advanced journal influence, or, you know, if you're at the upper division undergraduate course, Journal Influence 401. And this is the example of Dr. Charles Nemeroff, who was chairman of psychiatry at Emory University, past president of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neuropsychopharmacology, and among the key opinion leaders in psychiatry. He was also lead author on an article that he published in his own journal, this Journal of Neuropsychopharmacology, in which he and 7 of the other 8 authors failed to disclose that they were consultants to the company that made the device they touted in their review, or that, in fact, the review was written by the company. The 9th author, who actually worked for the company, did disclose their industry relationship. And we only know about this because it was outed by an investigative report at the Wall Street Journal, and it did lead him to resign. And his university then became a little more strict with him about the gigantic amounts of money that he was receiving from industry, and got him in trouble when he declined to report, and eventually he left that university for a much higher paying job at another university.
But it just came out that he and Schatzberg at Stanford authored a book that was completely ghostwritten. And so now they're even bigger.
Well, yeah, he's really had sort of a parade of events. So I'll skip advertisement to doctors, which includes the New York Times reporting that they use cheerleaders, so they are perfectly happy to appeal to other than just information and influencing doctors, and media PR, they're healthcare PR firms that spend a lot of money. An important point is that most medical PR is advertising dressed up to look as though it comes from an independent source. So that it comes in under the radar of critical appraisal, which is exactly what we saw with the journal articles, but it also happens in sources that go to the media. Education, much of medical education comes through the filter of the pharmaceutical industry. Reliable estimates put industry's expenditure on promotion to doctors at $18.5 billion, about $30,000 a year per physician in the United States. And that fraction of education had been growing. Let me just skip this. ACCME standards, which allow these MECs that are purely funded by industry to actually make their own curriculum. That may seem rather startling, and in fact some drug companies themselves are ACCME accredited, but then again almost half of the task force members on the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education are representatives of the pharmaceutical industry or consultants for businesses that work with industry in preparing educational materials. Does anyone really believe that medical educators are properly doing their job when they allow the pharmaceutical industry not only to subsidize their educational costs, but to help prepare the curriculum, recommend and pay the speakers, indirectly pay students and residents to attend, lavish free meals and other favors on attendees, and then promote the company's products at the meeting? And there was one particularly egregious example in 2002 that was outed by, again, by an investigative report. If I go to an American Heart Association meeting, the principal meeting, at least in principle, is only influenced in the usual indirect ways by the pharmaceutical company. They don't determine the speakers. They have a symposium in the evening where they put on lavish events and give you free entertainment and a lavish meal in charge for you sitting and listening to a favorably spun talk, but the main meeting isn't organized that way. But it was ascertained that the 2002 American Psychiatric Association meeting functionally was. The drug companies were given authority over who would be the speakers. In several dozen of the primary symposia during the week-long meeting, companies paid the AP about $50,000 a session to control which scientists and papers were presented and to help shape the presentations. Now, the argument when this was brought to the attention of the president of the American Psychiatric Association was, well, gee, instead of spending a couple $100 to come, doctors have to spend $500, and then nobody would be able to come. And of course, if the industry is paying a lot of the costs, then they expect to have some say. But of course, the problem is that if psychiatrists thought they were coming essentially to an advertising event, they wouldn't want to spend any amount of their time or money to come. But There's also evidence of influence for patient advocacy groups. Patient groups are increasingly and often secretly being sponsored by drug companies, which has begun fueling debate about the standards of disclosure for nonprofit groups. Pharmaceutical companies also often inaugurate and then fund patient groups that don't disclose the source of funding and do lobbying aligned with pharmaceutical companies' interests. They buy thought leaders and nurture allies, and this has come out in the discovery process, but also silence critics. And there are the fabled Merck neutralized memos in which, in Merck's words, problem physicians that had a negative view of their drug or favored an opposing one were to be, quote, neutralized by relatively more benign tactics like hiring them as speakers and giving them money to do trials. But in fact, the stick has been used as well as the carrot. And an example of this is when Dr. Buse first presented evidence that Avandia might have problems. Reportedly, in phone calls, drug company officials suggested he could be personally financially liable to the tune of $4 billion in lost market capitalization for his scurrilous remarks, which is obviously fatuous, but certainly very frightening kind of phone call to receive. And there's been a recent example where this influence operated by stakeholders for the pharmaceutical company. Jonathan Leo is a professor of neuroanatomy at a tiny little university or college somewhere who wrote a letter to JAMA saying, you know, this article that you published on the psychiatric drug compared to a non-drug treatment concluded that the drug was better, but the data in that article don't support the conclusion. And JAMA published that letter. But then after he sent that letter off, he did a quick little Google search and found, the authors of the article that claimed that the drug was better even though their evidence didn't support it, were in fact had conflicts of interest with that company that hadn't been disclosed. And he thought JAMA would want to know, so he contacted JAMA to tell them. And then he tried, they said they would look into it. And then he called, he emailed, he wrote. He couldn't get them to respond to him, and finally he wrote a letter to BMJ Online discussing this issue and got a phone call from deputy editor of JAMA Fontana Rosa telling him that unless he retracted his letter to BMJ, he'd be banned from Life for JAMA, he'd be sorry, his students would be sorry, and his school would be sorry. And editor-in-chief Catherine DeAngelis put pressure on his dean to force him, not that they could find anything factually incorrect in the letter, mind you, and tried charging that he had committed an ethical breach by bringing this to light before JAMA, who apparently had anointed themselves the supreme power, had finished whatever they considered to be their investigation. There have been other repercussions that have been shared with me by investigators. A French researcher approached me at a Heart Association meeting, recognized my name tag. Are you the one that published the study in Annals of Internal Medicine on low cholesterol and violence? Do you still have funding? And I recognized his name too. He had been the lead author on a study that had shown an adverse repercussion of low cholesterol, and he'd had an unrestricted career development award yanked from him. Another researcher at University of North Carolina looking at neurodegenerative adverse effects of statins had finally received a tiny pot of money from her university and had it pulled when another investigator at her university who had strong industry ties complained. Another investigator pulled me aside after a talk he gave when I was at UCLA, who had done an animal study showing adverse effects of lowering cholesterol, and said he thought I should know that a vice president of I won't say which major drug company called the chair of his department and told him it would be, quote, dangerous for them to continue to pursue this line of research. An Austrian researcher whom I approached at a Heart Association meeting after he gave a finding that showed that statins could cause an unfavorable effect in a subset of people, I asked if he'd had any adverse repercussions, and he said he'd in fact received a call from an industry official who told them that if he persisted in publishing this kind of thing, they would sue him, and that their lawyers were bigger and better than his lawyers, and that even if he won the case, it would destroy him financially. Now, he was way smarter than I would have been, and he responded, I've been taping your call, and I'll pass your threat on to my lawyer at the end of the call. And I don't know if that was true. I didn't ask. It may be legal in Austria. I don't know. And then there's, of course, instances of actual litigation. And one case is Nancy Oliveri, who kindly invited me to attend the award that she received this year from the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for her courage in the face of extreme personal challenge for trying to do the right thing. While doing a clinical trial of a thalassemia drug, she's a pediatric hematologist, she had found a potentially life-threatening side effect, had told the drug company of her intention to notify the hospital's research ethics board, her patients, and other clinicians. The company told her that that would be in violation of confidentiality agreement, and they would seek legal remedies if she carried out her intention. She felt it was her moral obligation to do so. not only the drug company went after her, but her own university did. By the way, her university had been promised multiple millions of dollars for building by that drug company. And she was relieved of one of her positions, referred to Physicians Disciplinary Board. The press received anonymous letters accusing her of misconduct that were later traced to a colleague who received money from that company. And fortunately, ultimately, she was vindicated by several investigations, but despite winning the initial lawsuit and being awarded a $15 million punitive damages, she's never received a penny, and they are continuing to tie her up in litigation. So this issue of litigation has not been an empty threat. And that was over 10 years ago, by the way. So we'll skip the FDA thing, except I'll give one example back to Avandia. In March 2006, Dr. Rosemary Jo Henley-Yang, supervising the Drug Safety Office, approved a black box warning for Avandia and Actos based on these heart problems that was recommended to her by one of the people who worked under her. An FDA official who worked more closely with Glaxo complained, and Dr. Jo Henley-Yang was ordered to retract her approval of the warning, lost her power to approve those assessments, and could no longer supervise reviews of the safety of those drugs. This was a very careful review that came to an inescapable conclusion. They decided to act like the review never happened and punish me for approving it. And so there's stacking the deck in industry, including a case where David Healy, whom we mentioned earlier in the context of ghostwriting, had a job offer, accepted a job offer from University of Toronto Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, came out and gave a talk there in which he presented evidence that Prozac may increase the risk of suicide. And the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which had received $1.5 million from Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac in recent years, then contacted him and told him that they were retracting the accepted job offer on grounds that his approach was not compatible with their goals for development, which is a word for fundraising for their institution. So actually, I'm going to try to go back by 2 maybe. So universities have financial realities. They also need to survive, but unfortunately they also have a fundamental mission and an obligation. And if they're not going to advocate for truth, who else is left to do it? Drug companies it is recognized that their stake is profit from manufacturing drugs. And unfortunately right now it looks like all of the other interest groups are functionally becoming arms of industry through these unequal partnerships where industry supplies the money. Yeah, so there's widespread acceptance of conflict of interest in academics. Some years ago, I was asked to debate on whether statins should be put in the water supply. And by the way, initially, they thought they wouldn't find anyone to take the no position, which tells you how bad it is. And the night before the debate occurred, my co-debatant, apparently forgetting that I was at the table, said to the person next to him, if I were to really disclose all my conflicts of interest, it would take 4 slides. To which she responded, if there's any company I'm not on the take from, come on over. So that gives you a sense of how comfortable people are with these industry conflicts. And these are the thought leaders, by the way, who were then invited onto guideline generating committees. And I'll skip the, and on the issue of guidelines, and a survey of people who were on clinical practice guidelines, CPG committees, found that of those who responded, 87% of those guidelines had authors with drug company interactions. An average of 81% of the authors had drug company involvement. They interacted with 10.5 different companies on average. 55% said their guideline had no formal process for even declaring the conflict of interest. Not that declaration is necessarily an adequate remedy. 7% acknowledged that their own relationships influenced their recommendations, while about 20% felt that their co-authors' recommendations were influenced by their relationships. So the thesis is that there are forces that work to favor recognition of drug benefits and disfavor recognition of drug harms. Facts procured don't match reality due to study design issues. Studies published don't match the facts procured through this failure to submit bad results, portrayal of bad results as though good, submission of good results many times, and even falsification to make data look better. In turn, the portrayal of studies don't match the studies that are published, portrayals including reviews, editorials, education, media, and advertising. Range of the oversight stakeholders are influenced, including patient groups, thought leaders, and the FDA, because of course it's headed by political appointees, and politicians there's a lot of drug company money that goes into supporting both sides of the political aisle in their candidacies. Also the IOM legal, and possibly the legal system through this Daubert principle, and ultimately guideline generation and patient care is affected. My performance pay is affected by my not giving patients for example, statin drugs, which I study, when I know that the evidence supports that benefits do not exceed harms in those groups. So I take the cut in performance pay, but most physicians may not choose to do that, and frankly, most of them don't know that the evidence doesn't actually support the guidelines. And it might be nice to think that these are all things that happen kind of haphazardly, but there actually is evidence that there are orchestrated campaigns. And by the way, if you were the head of a company with billions of dollars at stake and a perception that your stockholders were your primary obligation, you'd be doing these things too. In a sense, I don't even think that drug companies are at fault. You could argue that putting all the eggs in the drug company basket through all the research and oversight groups and so forth having conflicts is the crux of the problem. But early in 2000, the director of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry privately described the association's carefully thought out campaign. The ABPI battle plan is to, quote, employ ground troops in the form of patient support groups, sympathetic medical opinion, and healthcare professionals, which will lead the debate. This will have the effect of weakening political, ideological, and professional defenses. Then the ABPI will follow through with high-level precision strikes on specific regulatory enclaves. And if this isn't chilling to you, it probably should be. But these concerns are in no way specific to vaccines, but evidence from the vaccine I have studied, the anthrax vaccine, suggests that these stakeholder conflict of interest issues extend to them as well. And I'll just sort of stop here. So here we have a slide showing a sort of centenarian from the former Soviet Georgia talking to a Western reporter saying, our reputation for longevity is based on several factors: hard work, simple food, lack of stress, and the all-important inability to count correctly. And unfortunately, the evidence suggests that for many drugs, it may be the case that the evidence of benefit also amounts to what is functionally the inability to count correctly. So thank you very much for your attention.